Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the May 2025 Seraph Automotive webinar. We've been doing these for quite a while. We're getting a lot of feedback. We're getting a lot of great participation from people in industry. Please continue to participate in the surveys when you get them, forward them to friends. Let's make sure that we're getting as wide a selection of responses as we can. The more we get, the better this survey is. We've got a lot to talk about today. Tariff chaos continues to be key, but since we're doing separate tariff webinars, we're not going to focus on tariffs on this particular talk. We're going to really focus on the data that's driving the automotive industry, trends that we're seeing, what people are doing, and how they're driving things forward. It's been a very complicated year so far, and we're at the point in time where we need to make some clear strategic decisions and execute relentlessly in order to get results. I'm joined by two of my colleagues today on this webinar. Justin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Justin Fortier. Currently, I lead market research and insights here at Seraph. So I've really enjoyed getting to see a lot of your feedback across our surveys and get your comments in email and talk to you about them at different events we're at. So thank you to everyone who participated and for providing your view. This really helps it make it valuable for everyone.
Yeah, I'm Harrison Catlin. I'm a consultant here at Seraph. Later on in the webinar, I'll walk you through a little bit of the modeling that I've done related to tariff costs and how they might pass through to customers.
So these two gentlemen are absolutely key to what we're doing here. Let's get into the slides and let's talk about what's going on in the automotive industry. Thanks again for joining us. So there was a lot that we learned from our May 2025 auto report. Looking back, there were a lot of challenges since the beginning of this year. Chaos has reigned supreme. We're seeing a lot of nervousness, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of pause within industry. People have been trying and hoping to get clarity in terms of what the administration's policies will be, how globalization will be impacted, and what the path forward is. We're now nearing the end of May, and decisions need to be made in order to save the year. Profit needs to be secured, margins need to be fought for, and actions need to be taken. A lot of time has passed with inaction, so now's the time to move forward.
Shifting now from looking in the rearview mirror to looking ahead, we surveyed leaders across our clients and past webinar attendees to identify key challenges for late Q2, Q3, and into Q4. Now, typically when we look at this type of unstructured data that we collect, asking them where their biggest challenge they see for the next 6 months, we typically see responses cluster around several topics, but it's rare for a single issue to dominate. Yet now, over 50% cite a trade and tariff policy as their top concern. And I think through all the issues we're looking at here, the common thread is uncertainty around tariffs, demand, and for suppliers, OEM strategies, especially not only regarding tariffs, which they feel in the dark on, but for EV timelines as well. I was at a recent supplier event with MEMA where a few were voicing frustration about some significant investments they made and had capacitized for, where the start date was continually pushed back. Meanwhile, speaking to OEMs, they're unclear about where tariffs are going to end up and where they should focus their efforts to both mitigate the tariffs that are on their imported vehicles, as well as for their domestic vehicles, how they can support suppliers in getting a cost-effective supply chain for this new regime. So looking at this data, Ambrose, did you have any more thoughts?
For me, looking at this, Justin, it really is, it's a two-pronged thing here. It's demand and it's trade policy and tariffs. That is what is occupying the forefront of everyone's mind. And that's a shift from volumes from last year now into the trade policy stepping up to be front and center, which wasn't on anyone's radar last year.
Yeah, and one other piece, since we now have been doing this survey for several years, we can really see that labor and talent has dropped down in relative importance as being listed as a top challenge, but we still see, as we'll talk about later, that in many of the key roles, like in the skilled trades, it's still more difficult to hire. So it's not necessarily that it's diminished in importance in absolute terms, but just relative to the size of the challenge in terms of tariffs and volumes that are weighing on the industry.
So suppliers continue to have better global margins than OEMs, but OEMs have a bigger percentage of the EBIT pool. We're seeing this divergence happen again. We're seeing suppliers regain the position where they've got better margins, and they need that coming into this tariff position. It's interesting to look at how President Trump wrote the tariff rebate executive order. It gives the OEMs the ability to distribute the rebates to the suppliers. So the OEMs can protect their margins, but here the falling margins for the OEMs is a concern. And I think we need to watch that fairly closely. Suppliers will need more support from the OEMs as things move forward, as programs are paused or canceled, as product lines are adjusted, as shifts happen. We're going to see a lot more pressure on the supply base, and the OEMs need to at least have their treasuries full so that they can continue to support the weaker suppliers. Unfortunately, in automotive, we need all of the suppliers on a vehicle to be able to perform and deliver to build those cars or trucks. And anytime we see distress, and we're seeing increasing distress, we need to just be aware of that, and we need to make sure that we understand how those suppliers will survive.
Looking at overall volume, it seems that consumers in the US pulled forward some purchases to beat tariffs. That's what we're attributing the spike to at this point in terms of volume, bringing us up to 1.4 million. Now, Europe is mostly flat. We're not seeing any major changes related to this, and we wouldn't really expect to since parts tariffs didn't hit at this time. But Europe's mostly flat, and I think as we look, Europe continues to just be down from pre-COVID, and I think that's just one other reason why, if Europe has potentially hit peak car, why European companies have looked elsewhere for growth, including the US and China, the largest global market, to be able to continue to grow as the home market is fairly stable.
And we're seeing a lot of those European suppliers shift production to China, and those parts are coming back to Europe, and even the vehicles are coming back to Europe. So it's very interesting to see what's going on there. As prices come down because of the Chinese impact, maybe we'll see things change here. But right now, I think the average age of vehicles is high in the U.S., it's high in Europe, and Justin, you may be right. We may be nearing peak car in Europe. We'll have to wait and see if we're nearing peak car in the U.S. or not. But as we don't see more vehicles, as we don't see a lot of growth, as we see the average age getting higher, we need to really evaluate what we're doing. If the price is too high for consumers, are we building cars that are too reliable and have too much quality? Which is never a question I thought I'd ask. As a consumer, I want cars to be highly reliable and have high quality. From an industry perspective, that may be a very painful thing. So inventory is declining as sales increase, and we think that this is a big impact in the U.S. due to consumers pulling their purchases forward. A significant impact from February to April, a 17% decline in vehicle inventory. So we look at days on hand numbers later, and we're going to look at where specific OEMs are. But for me, that's a very interesting piece. And we're not seeing a huge decrease in vehicle price. We're seeing it roughly flat. They're not as willing to buy new vehicles. We're hearing a lot of people looking to keep their vehicles on the road longer. It's great for the aftermarket and service parts businesses, not so good for new vehicle sales.
So as we look at the April 2025 Vehicle Affordability Index, it's coming in at 37.7 median weeks of income. And if we were thinking about the previous slide and you look at prices having difficulty continuing the increase from 2020 to 2023, this is definitely one of the underlying reasons why, is that it became unsustainable to continue to get more volume by asking consumers to pay more and more of their annual earnings in order to get a vehicle. Just watching at the 5-year mark, if you compare this April to April of 2020, we're asking people to pay 12% more time. OEMs are benefiting from increased tariffs on Chinese vehicles that could dramatically lower this, but it's difficult to expect pricing to be a lever that OEMs can use.
And Justin, to put it in real terms, I mean, they have to work 4 more weeks to afford a car, and that's a significant amount of extra labor to be able to buy a car. If all you're doing for an additional 4 weeks is paying for your transportation, which is a key thing to get to work and get around and live life, it's hard. We're still off of the levels we were pre-COVID, where cars were much more affordable for consumers.
Yeah, and some of the drivers for this month in April for the affordability declining was higher prices, lower incentives, and income growth could not offset those increases. And 2 other data points that we looked at in regard to vehicle affordability is the stratification of different buyers. And so subprime buyers have lower credit ratings. They make up about roughly 16% of the overall buyers. And we've seen since the pandemic, subprime delinquencies increase. And if we go to the next slide, we see that recovery rates have also declined on defaulted auto loans. So this just shows that there is some additional stress that's growing in the system.
When we look at the data that we have here, one of the things that we're seeing is reducing logistics costs. And I'm believing that people are putting the increased tariffs into their effort to reduce logistics costs. They're putting tariffs into this cost bucket right now. We didn't have a specific category for tariffs because we didn't think that there were opportunities to drive operational improvement around tariffs other than footprint consolidation, which are more commercial activities. But we saw people focus more on reducing logistics costs. We do know that freight carriers are lowering rates a bit. There's less volume moving. There are some opportunities to requote and secure better costs for transporting freight.
Yeah, Ambrose, in general, our survey respondents were more pessimistic about the effectiveness of cost reduction efforts, but ultimately that's marginal pessimism. We still know that operational projects can drive real value and free up much needed domestic capacity for some of that footprint flexibility.
And we're not seeing any indications that the fundamentals of business have changed. So those 3 OEE elements we believe are absolutely key here. So what, from a commercial perspective, are companies finding possible? Something that struck me here was plant consolidations and relocations went down in terms of what people are seeing as possible. From talking to clients, from talking to others in the industry, what I'm hearing is that people just don't have the resources to do this internally. It's something that we all know takes hard cost out. OEE is low at plants. There is available capacity. So we could shift and we could consolidate and we could take advantage of moves at this point in time, and we could plan that. But with the paralysis that's going on, companies have paused these efforts, so they're not moving forward. We believe there's a pent-up demand. We believe people need to have dedicated teams, and we know people need to have the skills in order to make this happen. And very few companies have retained plant consolidation and plant relocation skills in-house. Supply chain restructuring has also fallen. Right now, it's no longer a cost savings or commercial measure. Supply chain restructuring is simply a key to survival. Very few people are looking at the lowest cost. They're looking for a lower total cost if possible, but they're also looking at supply chain resilience. So supply chain resilience, where you may be paying more, actually seems to be the focus of the day. Now, increasing the price charged to customers, a lot of people are trying that, but we're finding that very difficult. The tier 2 plus seem to have more success doing that than the tier 1s. And the OEMs right now, as we're seeing, are in a very challenged spot. Unless a car is in high demand, it's hard to pass a price increase on to consumers. It's just not what consumers have the money to pay for right now. We're already at a fairly high point in terms of the number of weeks it takes to pay for a car. So there's not extra cash in consumers' pockets to pay for that. We're also seeing renegotiating contracts with existing suppliers as being a point here. We are seeing some suppliers go to OEMs with conquest business where they've got capacity in a U.S. plant where they'll be able to take advantage of a tariff savings. They're able to win new business as one supplier from outside of the U.S. presents a higher bill. But we don't expect that to be a significant activity. We think this is going to be much more a discussion, and it needs to turn into a collaboration across the value chain so that everyone gets paid a fair price moving forward. That's not something that aligns to traditional automotive purchasing mentalities, but I believe it's something we really have to look at and we have to find a way to do better. If Western OEMs have traditionally been more antagonistic with the supply base, and there's been a much more contentious mentality in terms of purchasing procedures, protocols, and processes. Lots of levers that we can pull. This is one where, if you want to talk, we're happy to talk about this. But much like the tariff chaos that we're seeing, the levers that you can pull and how effective they're being vary based on where we are in the tariff chaos cycle.
So we've touched on how a lot of our survey responses were all honed in on tariff uncertainty, general policy uncertainty. And so we wanted to put this in context relative to COVID, which was one of the most uncertain times. And right now, the current landscape, according to the metrics we're looking at, is about 3 times more uncertain than it was during COVID, which is pretty stunning to look at. And as we look at how this has impacted different OEMs or suppliers, it's diminished their ability to give earnings guidance or project anything into the future. And we've seen companies pause their buybacks and take other significant measures to really prepare themselves to navigate this situation.
But we're getting to a point in the year where people have to start making decisions, Justin, and those are some of the discussions that I'm having with executives. We need to figure out how do we actually protect our margin and how do we move forward. We can't just pause. We can't be paralyzed by the chaos. We have to start to make decisions and make bets. And we may only have 50, 60, 70% of the data that we need. Sometimes we may have 30% of the data, but we can't stand still. So we need to be more dynamic in our responses, and we need to be able to pivot if we see something change as we're moving forward. But we're going to have to start making decisions. We're going to have to start deploying CapEx, and we're going to have to start moving forward with restructuring, with consolidations and closures, with product line rationalization, and with going back to customers to ask for money. No one wanted to be first. We're starting to see that happen. It's harder with things changing and continually shifting and the uncertainty that exists. We're seeing a lot of additional requests for transparency from customers, but those that will provide the data, those that will be transparent, and those that can make a clear and compelling case for price increases tend to be getting something right now. I wouldn't want to be the last one in asking. None of us wanted to be the first, but it's now time to move. We need to make decisions. We need to act. We need to move forward.
One data point that stood out in the survey was concern over the factors driving demand, specifically consumer sentiment. Reading through those responses led me to take a quick look at the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, the gray line, and compare it to real personal consumption data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So this is all US data, but since the start of COVID, consumer sentiment has dropped sharply, but personal consumption did continue to rise, except for a brief period in early 2020. Just to benchmark myself, I checked disposable income as well, where there's now a slight gap forming between income and consumption. So it's not dramatic. In short, there's a disconnect. Consumers are feeling worse, but they are still spending. Based on the commentary from the University of Michigan, much of that sentiment seems to be tied to uncertainty, yet we haven't seen that fully show up in pricing. OEMs haven't raised prices significantly in the automotive industry, and retailers like Walmart are still holding the line and pushing suppliers to contain costs, even though some prices are starting to change. So for now, sentiment is falling, but we haven't seen a fall off in consumption, but that's a contrast worth watching.
For me, none of this is going to be the single indicator that I'm going to look at, but it's very interesting to look at it and to see the divergence of different indicators and how you can't just rely on one data point to set your course and set your policy and set your strategy moving forward. Executives on this call have to make some decisions, and they have to be able to take this noise, process it, and with limited and conflicting information, make some really hard decisions in terms of how they're going to move forward with their company and what the strategy is going to be. And then they have to relentlessly execute.
So we've talked a lot about how expectations are really unclear, even at the OEM and supplier level. They're pulling earnings guidance, and uncertainty is really the big theme we've seen. But among our survey respondents, there is a bit of a consensus around automotive tariffs, both on finished vehicles and components. And the view right now is that they are here to stay, but at a reduced level. Our survey respondents are expecting maybe carve outs or a broad based reduction from that 25% level. But you can see through the rest of the year and even into 2026, a pretty strong majority of our respondents expect some level of tariffs on finished vehicles and components.
Right now, we've got a large portion of automotive components that are covered by the automotive specific tariffs, but there's also all the components that are not covered under that regime are under the reciprocal tariff, which right now globally is 10% for most countries except for China, which is at 10% plus an additional 20%. So depending on what type of auto part you're making, that could definitely influence how people were responding to this. And I think we wrapped up this survey data, 88% were in before the May 2nd statement released from the White House announcing the latest policy. But it is interesting about how many expect a cancellation to happen in 2026. Perhaps that's a hopeful number, or perhaps it's a reality of that consumers are not really interested in bearing further cost, as we've seen in the previous pricing data we looked at in this call.
Or just in an alternative view, is it could be that Congress, who had abdicated their ability to challenge President Trump's emergency orders, will regain that authority in 2026. And if the midterms are coming up and there are a lot of contested seats, then maybe we'll see Congress take stronger action. But with all the 232 investigations going on, with all the activity to formalize these tariffs, I think it's going to be very, very hard for these tariffs to be canceled. So I expect at least that base tariff rate to be here for as long as we have the Trump administration and likely into the next administration. Because you have to remember that the Biden administration did not move away from the tariffs that Trump had put in, even though they were so opposite in terms of policies. They held on to their China tariffs. They held on to the tariffs that were in place. So I think tariffs have become a bipartisan issue, and regardless of who is in office, we're going to have tariffs in place moving forward. It's just a new tool to fund the government, which is an old tool that was used to fund the government in the 1800s and early 1900s.
And certainly on China, I think that's where the bipartisan nature is most aligned. Perhaps on other geographies, that's TBD, at least in my view.
So similar to our survey respondents showing a pretty clear view that they believe auto tariffs are here to stay, we've seen that consumers are kind of echoing this view through their behavior. There's been a pretty strong surge in US light vehicle sales, and we can see this through days on hand inventory at dealer lots from February of 2025 to April of 2025. It's the shift from the gray dots to the gold dots on the screen. You've seen on average, brands have gone from 89 days on hand to 66 days on hand. And as you go further down the chart, you'll see a lot of brands that are now at a very, very low level and have less time before they're going to have to start either passing along tariff costs to their consumers, shifting product strategies, or just reacting in some way, where the brands towards the top of the chart have a lot more time to react.
One CEO of a consumer products company outside of automotive was talking about how at the beginning of the year in January, he was looking at his inventory and was kicking himself, thinking he had made a mistake by letting it build up and have so much capital tied up in inventory. And then the tariffs became real. Trump made it clear that he was serious about them. And now he's very happy that he had built up so much inventory. And I think we saw some of that last year. seemed unintentional. Perhaps somebody's got a crystal ball at one of these OEMs, and in which case, please give us a call. We'd love to to get it. But what was once a bit of a burden has now given them more time before they need to make a decision. Ambrose?
It seems that serendipity always is a key factor here. For me, what really strikes on this is how tight the inventories are becoming for the major Japanese OEMs. Subaru, Honda, Toyota, and Lexus have all seen significant compressions of their inventory, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with the tariff costs that are going to be placed on their vehicles. So the vehicles that are built in the US will be able to work around those, but those that are imported from Japan will become very challenging for them. So the margin squeeze is going to happen. As tariff volatility happens, we may see more OEMs want to push more to a build to order model. We tried that during COVID in the United States. It didn't work. Europe has always followed that model. But I think that the low inventories, particularly from the Japanese and even from some of the German OEMs, is really something that hits me hard and something that I'm going to continue to watch very, very closely.
Yeah, and if you are in the wait and see camp and maybe you're supplying some of the OEMs that have a little bit more time, or you're working for an OEM that has a little bit more time, as Ambrose pointed out, some OEMs are going to have to make decisions first, and those are the ones to watch and see how that's playing out across their supply base.
Yeah, so we just showed that depending on which brand you're looking at, there's some have maybe a month to react, some have a few months, but eventually decisions are going to have to be made about pricing pass through or absorbing the EBIT margin hits. And we've modeled this out a few times now, and I think we've shown it in a few different forums. We're looking at what price increases would have to happen across brands for them to fully pass along tariff costs to consumers. And recently it was announced that there's going to be some tariff rebate credits at 3.75% of a vehicle's MSRP for vehicles produced in the US that are importing components that otherwise would have been affected by tariffs. So we've baked that into these projections now. And you'll see that the pricing pass through has reduced slightly, but still on average, brands would have to increase their prices by 10% to fully pass these costs along. And that's because the imported vehicles are still a significant hit to margins here, whereas the tariffs on components, while this rebate program will actually have a pretty significant impact, I think we're looking at cutting out well more than half of the our modeled tariff component costs. There's still all of the full vehicle tariffs that are going to have to be passed along somehow. So these types of price increases, we talked about earlier that consumers really don't have the ability to absorb these hits. Then we're looking at, okay, if OEMs were to try to absorb the hits themselves and not pass along prices to consumers, how would their margins be impacted? Again, we've updated the modeling to incorporate the newly announced rebates. And what we're looking at here is still pretty significant. On average, a 3.1 percentage point hit to EBIT margins that are already not great, not really sustainable to take a hit of this magnitude.
So I think we're going to have to see a lot of shifts here. We're going to have to see a lot of different production patterns. We're going to see possibly product lines being rationalized. We're going to move to those higher value, higher volume vehicles that can have more US made components. That will raise some costs, but it may also raise wages. So we may see people be able to buy those desirable vehicles that have better margins. I think that the chicken tax still being in place, we saw the benefit of that over the years. That has prevented a lot of foreign companies from sending the SUVs and pickup trucks into the United States. And we'll see more of the domestic, and I use that word loosely, the former big three, the Ford, GMs, and Stellantis, lean into that and push to make sure that they can get the right vehicles in place and be able to protect these EBIT margins.
Yeah, just to jump in, Amber. So a lot of the US OEMs that in our previous modeling, we were looking at they're importing a lot of components and those tariff costs would stack up even for their domestically produced vehicles. Now with the rebates, a lot of those rebates actually cover the entirety of our modeled tariff costs there. It's more of the European OEMs that are still importing pretty valuable components like engines, motors, transmissions. Those will still struggle even with these rebates that we've modeled in. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so despite the tariff chaos that's going on, despite the need for data, despite the need to have plans in place, less than half our survey respondents have in their minds taken serious action to address the tariffs. So under half, 47%, have a dedicated tariff team and war room put in place. To me, that's key. And maybe the term dedicated, it was a stopper here, but from experience, I know that in challenging situations like these, you want to have a team that is focused full time on understanding this data. It can't just be part of their job. There are a lot of companies that are still evaluating plans and they're doing some scenario planning, but they're early days. And with all of the chaos, with all of the changes we're seeing, I think it's hard to be early days. And this is the one that struck me the most. There are 27% of the respondents here, which is a fairly large number, who are waiting for clarity before they start moving forward. They'll begin planning once there's clarity from the Trump administration. I think those companies will be waiting for a long time, and they'll be forced to react to the different policy changes. What we are seeing is that those that have war rooms put in place, those that have dedicated teams, are much better positioned to respond, have controlled responses, and really understand the end effects of those responses. Whereas those that are reacting are making snap decisions and having to move quickly because they're forced into a corner. Still, we're highly encouraging people to make sure that they are ready to respond rather than react. Lots of good data from everyone that responded, and we thank everyone that's responded here. But for me, it's clear that there's still a lot of work to do here, getting war rooms put in place, getting dedicated teams in place, and making sure you have that framework and you're ready to move forward.
Yeah, and speaking of reacting, we took a look at, okay, what were the expectations if tariffs were to be put into place and come to fruition? How did various respondents expect to be able to absorb costs from their suppliers and then pass along costs to their customers? And we broke it down by where they were at in the supply chain to try to get a sense of, do the expectations match up between any given transaction between a tier two and a tier one, or a tier one and an OEM. And what we've seen is there's actually a pretty big gap in expectations that might cause some friction when these tariffs actually have to be reacted to. So, first we looked at, okay, tier twos, how much do they expect to pass through to their customers, which would be the tier ones? And we saw only 44% of them thought that they could pass through most or all of these costs, whereas tier ones are expecting 78% of their suppliers to try to pass on most or all of the tariff costs. So it might be a bit of a pleasant surprise there, as tier ones are a lot more accepting of pricing pass through than maybe the tier twos expect. Now, on the other end, and more concerning, is the relationship between tier ones and OEMs. What we saw was that 53% of our tier one respondents expect to be able to pass through most or all of their tariff costs to the OEMs, but only 25% of OEMs feel that their suppliers, which are the tier ones, will pass on most or all of their tariff costs. So that's a pretty big gap. And we think it'll cause a lot of friction once, we talked about earlier, OEMs still have non-tariff impacted vehicles on dealer lots, and they're not having to increase prices yet, and there's still time to react. Once that runs out and they have to make these decisions, there's going to be a bit of friction between what tier ones expect and what OEMs expect. And then finally, at the last stage, OEMs passing costs along to customers. We talked a bit before about how during post-COVID era, OEMs were able to raise prices significantly. They could rely on a lot of stimulus that supported consumer behavior. At this moment, we're not seeing that anymore. OEMs, only 25% of them expect to be able to pass along a significant portion of cost to their customers.
And that's very telling. I think this, to me, the key takeaway for me is if you're a tier two plus, then you want to try to pass along those price increases fairly quickly to your tier one supplier customer. But as you go further up the supply chain, the tier ones are not going to be able to get that from the OEMs. And the OEMs are not going to be able to pass it on to the end customer. So we're seeing a squeezing margin here almost throughout the value chain. And it's going to continue to be hard to be in the automotive industry. It's never been an easy place to be. And this just adds to the complexity of what we're working with. So a lot of you have been on my tariff webinars. A lot of you have talked to us about this already. but I'm going to continue to talk about this because I think it's very important. And there's a lot of this that can be done internally within your organization. We're recommending that companies follow our 6-step approach. 1, you want to establish a war room with dedicated people. You want to develop a very robust supplier model. There's a tool called Altana. Palantir has tools. We're working with a lot of people using Excel spreadsheets and other tools. Make sure you have a model that has sensitivities and can adjust, and make sure it acknowledges what components coming from your supply chain are Chinese made or from a Chinese state supported company. When you're looking at rebooting your commercial strategy, take a more collaborative approach. Work with your supply base, talk to your customers, figure out what you can do, understand what your limits are, but always be data driven in these discussions. Fortify your balance sheet. If you haven't done it already, go talk to your banks, understand where you are in terms of covenants. If you're in a strong position right now, then get increased lines. If you're not, make sure you're not going to get lines pulled. Talk to the bankers and build those relationships. Reassess the product lines. There may be some other products that you have that really don't belong anymore. For those that you can cut, take a look at cutting them. And finally, and I think most effectively, look at best shoring your footprint, not just your own manufacturing footprint, but your supply base as well. President Trump was very, very clear in his Davos speech at the beginning of this administration that if you want to sell product in the United States, make it in the United States. So I'm encouraging everyone here to figure out where can they be, where should they be. We've spent a lot of work working on site selection models for companies lately, helping them to develop strategies in terms of where they can move. We're preparing management plans, and we're preparing to help companies find places that they can plant new plants within the United States or within the USMCA region. We believe the USMCA tariffs will rationalize, and while Trump doesn't like the current agreement, we think the tariff within this region will be lower than the rest of the world come the end of the year. Sometimes you need to make sure that you've rationalized and you've taken cost out in order to be ready for growth. We think this is the perfect opportunity to move more product into your existing facilities in the United States, and where possible, establish new facilities in the United States if you're serving the US market. Despite all of the protectionist efforts, despite the strategy to reindustrialize the United States, we're still losing attractiveness in the global manufacturing world to China. I'm looking at India, I'm looking at China here on this chart. China is up 17%, India is up 10%. What really strikes me here is Mexico is down 8%, the United States is down 4%, and Eastern Europe is fallen 8%.
Ambrose, I just wanted to jump in here quickly. Now, I noticed you said despite the protectionist efforts, but it could be because of these efforts that we're seeing some of these changes. Back to you.
So the survey respondents that we talked to, the people that contributed here, really are seeing a push to do more in China, to do more in India, to move away from Mexico. And I think some of that likely has to do with the challenge of getting labor in Mexico right now. Now, some of the discussions that we're having are companies who are looking at the United States, who are looking at moving more volume of business here. Product lines or entire plants will move into the country over the next 18 to 24 months. But those moves take time. So short term, we're still seeing people focusing on India and China. And I think that will likely be because of other global markets. If you're selling in the United States, if the US is the market you want, I think you need to be here. But if you're looking at the rest of the world, and this is a global survey, we're seeing companies still liking India and still liking China because of their skills and labor availability. So interesting data here. I think it's something we're going to continue to watch and continue to track the change.
One thing to add a little bit of color to what Ambrose just said is something I noticed in the China data. While overall it became more attractive, there was a shift from some people that were in the neutral or unattractive zone that did increase its very unattractive nature. So I think that speaks to what Ambrose is talking about, how for businesses that were using China as a source for US strategy to lower the cost of US goods, that strategy's underlying fundamentals have changed and gotten worse, but using China as a platform to serve China or Indonesia, etc., that that logic seems to have only strengthened. Which is, I think, brings us to a good time to take a little detour and just look at Chinese OEMs worldwide, especially in uh, Asia, West Europe, and Mexico.
Chinese OEMs are taking advantage of their technology leadership at this point in time. Their ability to launch a new product in 12 to 18 months far surpasses any Western auto companies. They're moving forward, they're meeting consumer demand, and they're treating cars much more like consumer electronics devices. As we see them continue to push and to gain market share, they're adapting faster, they're adjusting to customer preferences, and they're redefining the way that product development processes work. It's something that all of the Western OEMs need to learn from. We haven't talked a lot about technology in this particular webinar, but we wanted to leave everyone with this. As we look at how the Chinese OEMs are gaining market share across the world outside of the United States, there is a huge push, and it is a push of technological superiority, understanding that they can own their entire supply chain and be vertically integrated and bring lower cost, perceived higher value products to market very, very quickly. That pace of development, that integration of the supply chain, and the technological advantages that they're demonstrating at this point in time are going to continue to challenge us in the West as we look to move forward.
This one's interesting for us because we've been surveying now and we try to keep some of these questions the same so we can track the changes over time. But if we look on the left-hand side compared to 3 months ago, how has it changed for you? Skilled trades and maintenance continue every time we ask this question, we get a solid minority saying that it's become harder to hire. But that's one area where it seems like it's unrelenting in its increase in difficulty, which for us, the only logical conclusion from seeing something like that is that it is no longer a buyer's market. You really need to be a builder of talent and find other ways to bring that in. I think when you look at some of the largest businesses in the tech industry, as they've run into hiring and scaling challenges, whether it's Google, or I even saw Palantir as a similar program. Typically, they've only went for people that have come out of 4-year degrees, but now they're looking younger. Palantir is offering a program to high school seniors to join straight away. And I think it's not really anything new for the automotive industry to develop talent. I mean, Kettering and used to be part of GM. That was a program that they had maintained themselves in order to develop talent. But because so much talent was developed and companies were offshoring to other areas like China or Mexico, the need to develop talent domestically, whether you're in the United States acutely or even Europe to some extent, although they have much better programs, declined. But when we see this data marching on the same, it being harder to hire for skilled trades and maintenance, that leads us into larger companies are going to need to take a bigger role in making sure that that talent is there for them, because that's an aging talent pool as well.
I think that aging talent pool comment is absolutely key, Justin. I think when I walk through plants in the US and in Europe, I'm seeing an older workforce. I'm not seeing the impact of the apprenticeship programs. I think in Europe, those have really impacted the skilled trades, and you still have people moving through. You have some younger workforce in Europe, but in the US particularly, we have an aging workforce, and human resources has failed. They have been on a path for the last 25 years of cost containment and risk management. And we're now at a point in time, and we've been here for quite a while, where we need to shift back to human capital development. We're seeing that with the leadership gap. We don't have that next generation of leaders who are ready to step up and step in. And that, I think, is only going to become more challenging. But we need to start figuring it out today. Even with all the chaos, even with all the cost pressures, we have to find a way to invest in the next generation. Automation only takes us so far. We still need people. So let's develop the next generation.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about the fact that the US, according to our survey respondents, has decreased a little bit in attractiveness for automotive manufacturing, but we are expecting tariffs to kind of force people's hand a bit. And we do think there will have to be some shift in production to the US, but we know that labor is quite a difficult topic there, and it's going to constrain a lot of companies' abilities to scale up effectively. And we've had some work with clients on this exact question of how do they pick a location for a new plant? How do they help suppliers move into the US and what makes the most sense? And we've developed a framework or a model on how to suggest locations for them to move to and give a pretty comprehensive recommendation. And just here, we wanted to show kind of how, not a specific answer, because it really depends on a lot of things. It depends on land acquisition costs, plant construction costs. For some, energy costs are important. For some, they're not. But just on the labor question, we wanted to show how we're seeing a big shift to the Southeast and then a little bit of the Sun Belt over on the West in terms of population shifts and availability of skilled labor. And we have a model. It looks at where there's a concentration of talent, where wages are affordable, and where there's enough unemployment that you're not going to be competing with a bunch of other firms for talent, and where manufacturing could crop up in a successful way based on what your operations require.
Seraph is a very robust move methodology that we've developed over the last 20 years. I learned how to do consulting, how to do operational work from moving operations all over the world. We've moved hundreds of lines amongst our team. We understand how to move factories. We're very good at it, addressing tribal knowledge, understanding that products aren't ready to be transferred even when they're in production, and making sure that we capture things and we can make the same product in plant A as we do in the receiving plant B. So figuring that out is absolutely critically important. You need people that have a lot of experience to do it and do it well. If you don't have that within your organization, please reach out. We'd be happy to chat. Thank you for joining us on the webinar. We'd love to have some questions from you all at this point in time. So please feel free to reach out. Justin, what questions do we have?
Okay, we've got a couple that were submitted to me, but if anybody else listening can comment in either the comment section of YouTube or LinkedIn, we can take a couple more. But I think this first one is for Ambrose, and I'll also read the second one. So Harrison, you have a little bit to think about it. But for Harrison, are there any clear winners in your analysis? OEMs or certain suppliers with cost structures that can weather tariffs better than others? And maybe first we can have Ambrose answer. How do you weigh geopolitical versus labor availability risks?
That's a great question. I think geopolitical is one of those that it's hard to define. There's some mapping, there's some scenario planning you can do. Geopolitical risks versus labor risks are challenging. I was having a discussion with the CEO of a company who was looking to move to an island nation just to set up a plant where there's lower cost labor, but there is some geopolitical risk. My view is that if you're going to accept geopolitical risk, you want to make sure you have resilience in your supply chain. You have backups that you can fall over to where there is real and significant geopolitical risk. The geopolitical risk that we're facing right now is one that's much harder to plan for and structure for. Once we make an investment, once we have CapEx landed in a country, it's really hard to move. And then labor risk. I was reading this morning about all the robots that people are testing, that BMW, Tesla, Stellantis, General Motors are testing for plants. As I see those robots come in, the humanoid robots, there's a company called Future AI that I follow fairly closely, and we didn't touch too much on technology in this webinar. We'll do more in the next one. But as I see things like that come into play, we're going to see more need for the skilled labor, the people that take care of the robots, that take care of the programmers, and a lot of the other labor. There may be ways to supplement with humanoid type robots or other automation to ease that burden. So as we move forward, I think geopolitical risks will probably play a bigger role, and we'll look to find ways to automate out as much labor as we can effectively. We all remember when Tesla launched the Model 3, how they tried to do an absolutely automated assembly line. Then they ended up going through production hell, set up tents outside, and really moved to do something different there. I think that there are ways to automate that are effective, and don't cause that kind of quote unquote production hell. But you want to weigh those against geopolitical risk and the cost savings in labor, which is really labor arbitrage, why people go to places that have more geopolitical uncertainty.
And Harrison, I'm not sure if it makes sense to use any of the graphics we have up to answer the question about any sort of winners, but
I can cover it verbally, I think. So the big winner that we looked at was Tesla. Obviously, they're struggling for other reasons right now, but in terms of tariffs, they're not exposed to the imported vehicle tariffs, and the tariff rebate of 3.75% of MSRP is actually quite convenient for them. It covers essentially all of the component level tariffs they would be paying. So it puts them in quite a good place. Other than that, the losers would be more of the Japanese OEMs and European OEMs are not in a great position. I know if we looked across our analysis, Ford and GM did not look great, but a lot of it depends on their ability to get USMCA compliance with some of the vehicles they're producing in Mexico and Canada. So things could shift there. But again, I think Tesla was the obvious choice if you were to pick a winner.
And Harrison, if I go back to the chart with the profit margin, Mercedes seemed to do pretty well, and BMW seemed to look pretty good because they had higher margins to begin with.
Yeah,
What do you
that's
think about
true.
those?
Yeah, if you were to look purely from an impact to margins, maybe there's a different answer there. But yes, they have more cushion because of their higher margins to begin with. That's correct.
this one's probably more for Ambrose. But if you're a tier one right now and you're thinking about how to approach an OEM about the challenges with tariffs, what are you thinking about, and what advice would you have for a tier one?
You have to be very data driven and you have to be prepared to share data with the OEM. It's like any other commercial discussion. We want to try to get the OEM to be much more collaborative and supportive. Some of them are coming along to that. You want to make sure that you've laid out the case very clearly. You're able to articulate what the tariff and non-tariff costs are that are impacting and driving up your price. You want to be able to show where suppliers are pushing you. You want to look at your cash flow, having to pay these tariffs and how that's impacting your ability to deliver. The clearest and simplest thing I can say is with any OEM discussion, you have to be data driven, you have to be articulate, and you have to be very, very clear what your ask is, and you have to know what you absolutely need to get out of the meeting and be clear with that. OEMs are horse trading right now. They're not going to give you everything that you want, but if you absolutely need it, they'll probably step up. So it depends on how clearly you can make your argument, how the data supports it, and whether they're able to move fast or not. But data is key, as it always is in OEM discussions.
This one's from Peter Hassenkamp in the comments just now. Do you expect to see a large push from OEMs with final assembly in the US to achieve USMCA compliance and drive more of their supply chain into Canada and Mexico as well?
Peter, that's a great question. I think we're seeing and hearing OEMs working to bring more of their supply base into the United States, into Canada and Mexico as well, resource components and the excess capacity that exists because volumes are lower. We expect to see programs move, programs launch, and even program optimization. Um, you've been in this game for a long time, but I had a comment earlier, a call earlier from someone who was wondering about the Belvedere assembly plant, hearing rumors that may be being brought back up. Other plants that have been idled, hearing rumors that they may come back up. Don't want to give any voice to those rumors, but there are a lot of things being explored right now. And as these tariffs push and people acknowledge Trump's view that we need to reindustrialize and see Trump supporting the UAW, I think the former big three, the Ford, Stellantis, and General Motors will very much look at how can they move more into the United States to support his agenda and curry favor to hopefully get some breaks in other places where they need it.
Thanks, Ambrose. I don't think we have any more questions right now, so I think we'll wrap up. Um,
Thank Thanks everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure having everyone here. And when we started this off, it was technology was one of the pillars. We didn't cover that much today. In the next report, we'll cover that a bit more. We're looking forward to having further discussions. Feel free to reach out to myself, Justin, or Harrison if you have any more questions or want to have a deeper conversation. I'd love to talk more. Hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'd love feedback on if this webinar was valuable for you or what else you'd like to see. So please feel free to just drop us a line and let us know. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
Yes, thank you. And I'm just going to leave this up on the screen for a couple more seconds. If you'd like a copy of this report, uh, today, LinkedIn was giving us some issues with the subscription form. Being able to get everybody's email out of there. That hasn't happened to us before. So if you'd like to make sure you get emailed a copy of the report today, please scan this or go to seraph.com/subscribe. It would just give us your name and email so we can, when we share this report with everybody by tomorrow morning, this will allow us to get it to you. So thank you very much and hope you have a great day.